I don't know how you walked into church today or how your week has been, but maybe those lyrics are actually a reflection of your soul today. You're feeling a bit fragile. And if you're sitting here today, then I believe that God has a plan and a purpose for you being here. And my prayer for you really is that today God would move us from a place beyond fragility into a place where we can experience joy and peace. So God, our prayer this morning, God, is that you meet us where we're at, in the midst of life's fragility, as we're carrying these fragile baggage, God. And our prayer is that you would take us where we are and transform us to leave today with in a place of hope and peace and joy. In Jesus' name, amen. Kalia, if you could just stay there for the rest of today, that'd be awesome. Can you come on up? Can we give Kalia one more giant round of applause? You want to stand? Kalia is one of those people who live a truly inspirational life. And if you don't know Kalia, then get to know her because she's awesome. But Kalia, it is a privilege for us having you part of our family here at Gracegate. And thank you for sharing this morning. The way you live your life, honestly, it's inspiring. And it's inspiring many of us around you. So thank you. That's awesome. Big round of applause, guys. Thanks for that. Alrighty, fragile baggage. So, who of you guys, maybe with a show of hands, have ever traveled with one of these on your luggage before? Doesn't have to be this exact one with a fragile tag. A few of you. Yeah, I personally don't like the idea of traveling with fragile luggage. And there are a few reasons for it. One, because some of the videos that I've seen and stories that I've heard, and I asked Damo to prepare a little video for us so you guys can hit play. This is how some luggage has been treated at the airport. And so this is why I don't like traveling with fragile. So here's a fragile one coming along. So they'll definitely treat this one with care. It's got the big red fragile sticker. Apparently not. Here's some golf clubs. This one they'll treat carefully. Apparently not. So in case you were wondering what happens to your baggage, I'm not sure how they're treating this one, to be honest, because that seems very fragile. But the video kind of just cuts off. But that is terrible, right? And so because of that, I'm not a fan of traveling with fragile baggage. And as I was watching that video, I was thinking about the fact that that is a little bit how life sometimes feels like as well. Like, don't you think it would be awesome if you had a rough day at work, if you could go home and your kids could just line up wanting to cook dinner for you, or if I don't know, if things are going tight in the finances, if suddenly the kids didn't have to go to school anymore or go on camps. Like, it doesn't work that way, right? And so sometimes life is fragile, and we feel a bit fragile, but it doesn't come across in the way that people treat us or the way that life treats us. And in the midst of life's fragility, it is hard to then sometimes not become bitter at times, right? And so today we're going to be speaking about this baggage of bitterness that we sometimes pick up in the midst of life's fragility. Now, today when we refer to bitterness, I don't just want you guys to think of kind of unforgiveness and negative attitudes towards other people, although we would include that. But bitterness is actually bigger than that. And I think sometimes bitterness looks a little bit like this, and maybe you can relate to one of them. Sometimes it's that feeling of resentment towards something or a situation. Sometimes it comes in the form of self-pity, right? Like, the world's against me. Everyone's against me. Sometimes it's actually this victim mentality that we have sometimes, that actually things always go bad for me. I'm the victim in this situation. And sometimes, and I think a lot of us can relate to this, we end up asking the question, why me? Why me? And while this question may be a normal part of the grieving process, over time we can become stuck in that, and that can lead to bitterness. But bitterness is also bigger than just that, because bitterness is not just directed towards other people. It can also be towards ourselves, right? It can also be towards God. Why would God allow certain things in my life? And sometimes it's even just towards life itself. We don't actually know who to blame, but we just don't know that life and our situations are not quite what we'd hope it would be at this point in our life. And studies have shown the effects of bitterness, and you guys would know that, how bitterness can actually lead us to such a dangerous place, both for ourselves and our relationships. Studies have shown that it actually has the same effect as severe trauma in our life in terms of sleeplessness, fatigue, low self-confidence, the way we relate to ourselves. It can actually shift our personality negatively over time, but also in our relationships. Like, who wants to be in relationship with someone who's bitter all the time, right? And so we know it's not a good place to be in, but let's be honest, I don't think any one of us wake up one day thinking, you know what, today I want to be a little bit more bitter. Like, I know what's going to add value to my life today. I just need to become a little bit more bitter, right? Like, we know that's not true. We know bitterness is not a good place to be in, but it actually takes a lot of intentionality to not be bitter and to not kind of start adopting and carrying these bags of bitterness. And I also just want to say at the start, as a disclaimer, some of you guys in this room are walking through situations that I know is incredibly difficult. And you may even say, if you knew what I was walking through right now, like, you can't not be bitter when you're walking through what I'm walking through. And honestly, some of the situations in this room, your bitterness is 100% justified. That actually, it is completely understandable why you would feel bitter about life. But unfortunately, we know that just because something's justified, it doesn't mean it's helpful, and it doesn't mean it's moving us forward in life. And so how do we move forward when we feel bitterness towards our finances? Because everyone else seems to be going on holidays overseas, and we're stuck in this place that we've been for a long time. Or maybe for you, it's your mental health, where everyone around you seems to be happy, and you come to church and people seem to expect that you're always happy, but you're stuck in a place that's really difficult. Or maybe for you, it's your physical health. The doctors have diagnosed you with the condition that you can't do anything about. Or maybe it's relationships, a past relationship or a present relationship that's resulting in these feelings of bitterness. So how do we move forward? How do we actually not kind of take up these bags of bitterness in the face of life's fragility? Now, today we're going to look at a passage, and I don't want to pretend to be speaking as an authority on the subject, and so I've invited someone along that's going to share with us, and this guy had every right in the world to be bitter. If there was one guy, and I always find it encouraging reading his writings, because if there's one guy that had reason to be bitter, it was this guy. And so it's this guy called Paul, who lived about 2,000 years ago. And if you're wondering what Paul's credentials are, what authority does Paul have to speak into our lives today about suffering and bitterness, this is a glimpse of some of the things that Paul has experienced in his life. He says, I have been in prison more frequently. This was not in prison because of things he's done, but because of the way people have responded to good things that he was trying to do. I've been in prison more frequently. I've been flogged more severely and been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. So they had the Jewish custom that 40 lashes would pretty much kill you. And so if they don't quite want it to kill you, they would give you 39 of the lashes. So he says he's received that 5 times. And he continues, 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I've been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false believers. I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst and have often gone without food. I've been cold and naked. And besides everything else, I face the daily pressures of my concern for the churches. This is this guy's life. This is what his daily life is looking like. He's got no family, no home. He receives beating after beating. I don't know how you walked into church this morning, how your week has been, but I don't think it was that bad. This is severe. This is Paul's life. And in the midst of this, Paul writes a letter. He writes a letter that we're going to look at today, where he says, I want to tell you guys how I have chosen to respond to this. to life's fragility, to all these things that have happened. I want to tell you how I've decided to respond to this. Now, this letter that Paul wrote, that we're going to look at, he wrote from prison. He was actually under house arrest in Rome. He was arrested by the Jews in Jerusalem, sent to Rome. The Romans actually said that what you've done, and the reason he was arrested, because he was sharing this good news about God. He was saying God's love is actually for everyone. And the Jews didn't like it because they believed that God's love was only for them. And so they sent him to prison. The Romans then said, well, actually, you didn't do anything deserving of death. We want to release you. And then the Jews, Paul's own people, then said, they objected. And so Paul was then sent back into prison under house arrest, awaiting trial under the Roman emperor. Now, to make matters worse, the emperor at the time was a guy you may have heard of called Nero. Now, Nero is famously or infamously known as probably the emperor that was the most brutal towards Christians in the history. He would, instead of buying torches for his gardens, he would actually use Christians, set them on fire, and that was how he would light up his gardens. This was a guy that was brutal. And so Paul is in this situation where he's got nowhere to go except awaiting trial under Nero. So he's in a pretty fragile space, and he writes this letter because Paul realizes, and that's something I think we all will realize at some point, that he now has a choice to make. Will I become bitter? Will I become resentful? Will I adopt this victim mentality? Will I stay stuck in this place of why me? Or is there a different way to respond to this trial? And so in this letter that we're going to look at, in Philippians 4, Paul makes a statement. And this is what he says. And honestly, before we even look at that, there are a lot of statements in the Bible that you go, wow, this is significant. I'm not sure that there is a statement for me that's more significant than this one. In terms of Paul, if there is something that I want to learn, it is this. Paul says, I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. Paul says, I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. But I have learned. In other words, it didn't come naturally. It happened over time. But by investing time in this, I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. And I read this, and you guys don't seem to be as amazed as me by that. But I lean in and I go, I want to learn that. Like, if there is one thing in this world that I want to learn, it's this. Because if you can be content, if you can be joyful regardless of your circumstance, surely there's nothing better to learn than this. And lucky for us, by showing up today, you've actually signed up to Paul's class where he's going to teach us how do we actually get to this place where we can be content, where we can be happy, where we can be joyful regardless of our circumstances. And so Paul writes this letter to the church in Philippi, because in Philippi, Paul had gone around, shared this good news about Jesus. And so he shared this message, and this church formed, and now the church is there waiting to hear news from Paul. Paul, what's going to happen in your trial? What is the outcome of your situation? And they can't follow him on Instagram. They can't look at his Twitter account. They can't look at his story to see if he's still alive or not. So they're awaiting news, and they receive this letter all the way from Rome, all the way to Philippi, with news from Paul. And I can almost see them gathering everyone around, everyone sitting in the room, and they're awaiting news. Paul, what happened to Paul? And I could almost see the person reading kind of shivering as they open up this letter where Paul writes. And he starts off and he says, to all God's holy people in Christ Jesus at Philippi, together with the overseers and deacons. This is my letter to you. And then they read, grace and peace to you from God. And they're like, Paul, that's not important. What is the outcome of your situation? And he continues to write, I thank my God every time I remember you in all my prayers. And I could almost hear them say, Paul, what is the outcome of your situation? Are you going to live or die? And he continues writing, it is right for me to feel this way about all of you. And this is my prayer, that your love may abound. And he continues, and I can almost hear them begging Paul, what is the outcome of your situation? And then in verse 12, Paul writes, now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me, and you can almost hear the sigh in the room that finally Paul is going to share with them, what is the outcome of a situation. Paul doesn't. Not immediately. In fact, to him, the outcome of a situation is not as important as the principle that he wants to teach them, that actually, regardless of your situation, regardless of the outcome, it is possible to be content. And so this is where we're going to pick up this letter that Paul writes. And there's just three things today that we're going to look at. Three principles that Paul teaches them and how to be content regardless of your circumstances. We're going to look at that and then we're done. So the first one is this. Paul writes, "Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel." Now, if you're new to church and you're wondering why Christians seem to have words for things that are just actually simple concepts, I often wonder the same, but gospel just means good news. And so it's just this idea that actually there is a God who loves me, regardless of my past, regardless of my present. There is a God who loves me and a God who wants to step into my future and give me a life of meaning and purpose. And this is the gospel. This is the good news that Paul has now shared with them. And so Paul says that what has happened to me has actually served to advance this message. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. And so in this first passage, I believe the principle that Paul is trying to teach us is this: choose carefully what you value most in life. If you want to get to a place of contentment regardless of your circumstance, choose carefully what you value most in life. 'Cause this is the principle, and really it's quite simple. It's this, that whatever we value most, whatever we give most weight to in our life, our joy will be dependent on that thing. Right? Let me give you an example. If say the All Blacks winning the World Cup is your biggest priority in life, that is the thing that you value more than anything else, then your ability to have joy will be dependent on the All Blacks winning the World Cup, right? Like if they win it, you'll be happy. If they don't, you won't be. It's the same even for good things, for noble things, for, say, our family. If your family, yeah, that was noble as well, but say your family, if your family is your biggest priority in life, if that's where you value most, then your joy will be dependent on how your family's doing. If your health is your biggest priority, then your joy will be dependent on how your health is doing. If going to the moon with Elon Musk is your biggest priority, then your joy will be dependent on whether you go to the moon or not. And so that's what Paul is saying. Actually, this principle, this next one, that says our contentment, our ability to have joy is dependent on what we value most in life. And so Paul is not saying, and especially if you don't consider yourself a Jesus follower, Paul is not saying what you should and shouldn't value. In fact, you have the freedom to decide that for yourself. I'm certainly not saying what you should and shouldn't value. Paul is just saying, choose carefully what you do value, because that is what your joy will be dependent upon. And so Paul is saying, as for me, you can choose what you value, but I have made a decision that actually coming to know God for myself, having a relationship with this God who loves me, that this idea that I can connect with God, that is my biggest priority. And as I'm learning and coming to know the awesomeness of this relationship, I now get to share that with other people. And that has become my biggest priority in life. And that is something that is not dependent on circumstance. I can do this even though I'm in chains, even though I'm in prison. And so Paul is saying, whatever you choose to value, make sure it's something that is strong, something that is secure, something that is not dependent upon circumstances. And so how often does it happen that we sometimes place our hope and our value in what other people think of us, or whether someone likes us or not, or how many followers we have on Instagram, or whatever it is, and then we wonder why we're not experiencing joy and peace, and it's because we have placed our hope and our joy and our contentment in something that is fragile. And Paul's saying if what you value is fragile, then your contentment will be fragile as well. That's the first principle. So Paul is saying if you want to reach contentment regardless of your circumstances, choose carefully what you value most. in life. Paul continues his letter, and he writes this: "It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry." And so what happened at the time, there was already a lot of hostility towards Christianity in that time. And so some people didn't like Paul very much because they believed that this gospel, this message of God was exclusive. And Paul believed that it was for everyone. And so some people didn't like him. And so at the time, there would be people that would actually share this message, not because they believed that God was good and they wanted people to know that, but because they knew that that would get Paul in trouble and just build up the hostility towards him in prison. And so Paul is saying, he's responding to this, and he's saying, it is true, you've heard correctly, that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others do it out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. Paul's saying, you know what, some people like me and some people don't. But I'm not going to go on Facebook posting about it. I'm not going to start gossiping about it. I'm not going to adopt this attitude of bitterness. Instead, this is how I'm going to respond to this. And he writes, but what does it matter? What does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice. Now, the second principle in this passage that I think Paul is trying to teach us is really found in this phrase: I am put here for the defense of the gospel. Now, I know it's a very churchy phrase. A lot of the language in this passage is, but I believe it has principles that is applicable to us regardless where we find ourselves on our faith journey. And so Paul is saying, I'm put here for the defense of the gospel. Now, I've got a question. Who put Paul in this situation? Who put Paul in prison? I would say it was the Jews, right? It was the Jews who arrested him. And I would say it was the Romans who imprisoned him. And then I would say it was the Jews who then, after he was released, objected, so he was put back in prison. I would say they were the ones that put Paul there. I would say it was Nero whose hostility towards Christians caused him to be in prison, right? And I would say the reason Paul was put there was to await trial, was to find out whether he's going to live or die. That's what I would say. But that's not what Paul is saying. That's not how Paul views it. He's saying, yeah, it may have been Nero, it may have been the Romans, it may have been the Jews who put me there. I'm not going to blame it on God. It wasn't God, it was the people who put me here. But you know what? I'm not put here to await trial. I am put here for a different purpose. I'm not put here for the purpose of people. I'm put here for a different purpose. And what Paul does here is something that we're going to have to learn to do with our chains if we want to reach contentment regardless of our circumstance. And that is this, that Paul is redefining his chains as something that is not a result of opposition, but that is actually an opportunity that God has given him to reach people that he wouldn't otherwise be able to reach. I am put here for the defense of the gospel, and I'm going to redefine the season that I'm in. See, Paul could have been stuck in the season where actually everyone's against me. Why me? I'm going to become bitter. And Paul says, no, I'm not going to view this as opposition. I'm going to view this as an opportunity given by God to reach people that no one else could reach. Yeah, I wouldn't have chosen these chains. I wouldn't have chosen to be here. But now that I am, I'm not going to waste it. I'm not going to waste this season. I'm not going to waste this relationship that I had. I'm not going to waste the health struggles that I'm going through. I'm going to use it as an opportunity to reach people with my story. I'm not going to waste the struggle financially that I have in the season. I'm going to use it to learn an aspect of God that I wouldn't be able to learn outside of these chains. I'm not going to waste the season of singleness. I'm going to use it as an opportunity to use my time and invest in people. I'm not going to waste the season that I'm going through. That's what Paul is saying. I'm going to redefine the season, not as opposition, but as an opportunity. See, a lot of us, and I'm so guilty of this, we get stuck in this why, in the space of why me? Why did it happen? Last year I was going through something difficult, and I spoke to a mentor of mine, and I asked him, why? Why do you think I'm going through this? And he looked at me with so much grace, and he said to me, yeah, that's a normal question to ask. And you know what? In time, you'll learn that it's the wrong question to ask, because that question is not going to move you forward. Why? Why did this happen? Instead, he said, how do you think God can use the season that you're in? What is the gift? What is the gift that God wants to give you in the season of chains that He can only give you while you're in chains? God has got a gift for you in this season of chains that you can only receive while you're in it. And some of us today need to actually acknowledge that we've been stuck in the season of asking why the whole time, when sometimes we will know the answer and sometimes we won't. But instead, how do you think God can use this season? What is the gift in this season that God wants to give you? And so that's the second principle that God is teaching us. The first one, choose carefully what you value most in life, because if what you value is fragile, your contentment will always be fragile. And second one, redefine your chains. What seems like a hindrance may actually be a help. That maybe God wants to give you a gift in this season that you can only receive while in chains. And then the last thing, the last paragraph, Paul continues and he says there's one more thing. That if you want to learn the secret to being content, regardless of your circumstances, there's one more thing. So he ends the previous section with, I rejoice. And then he continues. And I'm wondering, Paul, are you sure it's rejoice? Are you sure you're not just talking about contentment? Joy is something else. And he says, no, you heard me right. Yes, and I will continue to rejoice. I love that. I have made up my mind. This guy's resolute. This guy has made a decision. Yes, and I will continue to rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, that what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage, so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. Like, what is anyone going to do to this guy? He's decided that whether I'm living or whether I'm dying, whether I'm in chains or whether I'm not, I have already decided that I'm going to rejoice. I have fixed my mind upon rejoicing regardless of my circumstances. And this is the third principle, that Paul is saying, you know what? I'm actually not a hostage. I may be in chains, but I think I'm freer than all of you guys. I may be in prison, but I'm free. I'm not a hostage. I'm not a hostage to my health struggles. I'm not a hostage to my mental health struggles. I'm not a hostage to my relationships. I'm not a hostage to my upcoming court case. I'm not a hostage. I'm free. I'm free. I may be in chains, but I'm free. I'm free. And this is what we have to learn to do. Don't miss this. That Paul has actually decided to set himself free from the prison of bitterness and resentment and asking why me and being stuck in a place where he sees himself as the victim. Paul has already set himself free from that prison, and so he's free regardless of his circumstances. Paul's saying my situation may be fragile. In fact, my bags are very fragile, but I'm not. I've already made up my mind that I'm going to rejoice. I rejoice, and yes, I will continue to rejoice. I will continue to rejoice. And so the last thing that I really just have to show you is this phrase: eagerly expect and hope. So I don't know if you know, but these letters weren't originally written in the English language. When Paul wrote them, they were written in Greek. And the translators did an amazing job of translating it so that we get the content and the meaning. But sometimes what gets lost in translation is a little bit of the power, the punch, the kind of imagery that comes with it. And so in English, they translated this phrase as eagerly expect and hope. The Greek word that Paul used is this word, apo, kara, dukia. Apo, kara, dukia. Apo, kara, dukia. Now, it may surprise you, but this word is made up of three different words, which are apo, kara, and dukia. And so Paul, this is not a common word. It wasn't a common word back then in the Greek language. Paul actually took this word from some of the Greek classics at the time. And what that word was referring to was kind of this idea of a watchman standing on a tower, kind of craning his neck, trying to peer into the distance. And so apo actually means from or off. Kara means your head or your mind. And dokia means to look or to watch. So this phrase that Paul uses is this idea that to watch, to look, to gaze intently at something. But in order to do that, you have to take your eyes off of something first. And so one of the commentaries on it, they said actually this describes a person whose attention is turned away from all other interest and fixed upon or riveted upon just one thing. Just one thing. And so Paul is in chains. Paul is in this season where he's been bound by these chains. It's a season that he wished he was not in. It's a season he didn't choose for himself. It's a season he's in because of other people's actions. And he's got every right to become bitter towards how difficult his situation is. And Paul says that I actually had to do something. If I focus, let me even put myself in these chains. Let's tie them up really tightly. Paul's saying, you know what? I may be in chains. And you know what? If I fix my eyes on these chains, I'm going to lose hope. I'm going to lose hope. Maybe you've been stuck in this season where your situation, whatever that thing is that you've been thinking about this whole morning, that thing, where that thing has you bound and you feel powerless to respond to it because of how fragile the situation is causing you to feel. Paul's saying, I know what that feels like. To be in prison, to be in chains, to not be able to move my legs. Yeah, and if I focus on these chains for too long, then I'm going to lose hope. But you know what? While my legs are in chains, my mind is free. And so I actually get to decide how I view the situation. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to take my mind and my eyes off of my chains and off of my situation. And I'm going to lift up and stand like a watchman and peer into the distance and try to see something that's way beyond the situation that I find myself in right now. And so Paul's saying, if I look at these chains, I'm going to become bitter. I'm going to lose hope. But you know what? I've got a decision to make, to fix my eyes upon Jesus, the author and the finisher and the perfecter of my faith. I'm going to fix my eyes upon a God who cares about me, who loves me, who's going to respond to me, who's actually standing with his arm outstretched, trying to lift me up despite my chains. And the reason he could do that is because Jesus himself went through these chains. And he knows what it's like, and I can almost see Paul imagining as he's looking in the distance, seeing Jesus with his arm outstretched, longing for us to invite him into our situation, into our chains. And Paul is saying, yeah, I have been sick for a long time. Yeah, I have struggled with this for a long time. But you know what? If I stay stuck in this place of focusing upon these chains, I don't know if they're going to go away. I don't know if I'm going to live or die. I don't know. I don't know the outcome of my situation. But I serve a God who I can look to, where regardless of my situation, I can find hope and joy in a God who wants to meet me regardless of these chains that I'm in. And you may be sitting here wondering, Paul, how do you get to that space? How do you actually do this? And that's where Paul ends this letter, this passage, just after he said, I can find contentment regardless of my circumstance. Paul writes this statement and he says, you know what? I couldn't do it alone. But you know what? I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. Yeah, I know it's hard. I know it's difficult. I know you feel like giving up sometimes. I know you feel like carrying bags of bitterness because the situation has got you in chains. I know it's hard. And I know you can't walk through it alone. I can't either. But you know what? I can through God who gives me strength. And God's not going to do it for him, but God is standing with his arms outstretched, waiting for Paul to invite him into the space where he's actually saying, I can't do this alone. I can't reach that point of contentment on my own. But I can do it. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. And I believe that's what God wants to do in our situations this morning, is that we would find ourselves in these chains. And some of us, we're in chains that we don't know how long it's going to last. We don't know if it's ever going to get better. We don't know the outcome of the situation. But Paul is saying, you know what? It is possible. It is possible to be in that space and still have hope and joy as you fix your eyes upon Jesus and you see that life is bigger than these chains. There is so much that God can do in and through my life. Not just despite these chains, but because of it. And that thing that you've been thinking about the whole morning, that thing that is stuck in your mind, that causes resentment and bitterness in your life, that thing, God is saying today, that thing can become the epicenter where God can do the greatest thing in and through your life. Recently, I had the privilege of seeing what this looks like in a modern kind of context. I've got a friend who I studied with at uni. I think this is her. Her name's Jess. She's been struggling with her health for a while now. And recently they did some tests and they actually found a really large tumor in her lung, cancer tumor. And I asked her, actually before I even asked her anything, I read this post that she made on Facebook where she was kind of updating people on her situation. And she said this: hey everyone, just wanted to give you an update on a few things. And then she starts off saying, I do want to give a huge thank you to those who've been praying and sending messages, as well as a big shout out to the amazing hospital staff who've been taking care of my family and I. And then she goes on thanking a list of people for everything they've meant to her in this season. And then she says, if you are able to be praying for my family, that would be awesome. Their world has been totally flipped upside down. As I'm sure many of you have experienced, watching someone you love in so much pain is difficult and will take an emotional and physical toll. And then she says, after all of that, after thanking and making sure everyone else is all right, she makes a statement at the end and she says, as for me, I am so thankful that I belong to the God whose miracles begin in the same place where the impossible starts. And then she says this, and I am excited in the midst of this chain. I don't know if it's going to go away or not. I don't know if I'm going to live or die. In the midst of this, I am excited to see how God is going to use this to bring opportunities for people around me to encounter Jesus. So I'll count the joy come every battle because I know that's where you'll be. And I messaged her, and like Paul said, earnest expectation. I eagerly hoped, had an earnest expectation that she'd be able to come and share with us today. She wanted to, but just because of treatment and where she lives, she wasn't able to. But I asked her, so Jess, how do you respond like this? How do you deal with grief and loss instead of becoming bitter? And she says this, I think part of the reason for this is because of the hope and peace and joy that God brings when we are suffering or walking through trials. And this then gets to be an opportunity for the most incredible testimonies and encouragement to other people. And she speaks of this incredible gratitude that she's been experiencing this whole time. And then she ends and she says this, if I could say anything to people, it would be this. And this is the last thing I'll say today. If I could say anything to people, it would be this, that without a doubt, no matter what trial you're going through or what trial you will go through, whether it's relationships, jobs, loss of a loved one, financial, that God is waiting. God is waiting with an overwhelming and incomprehensible amount of joy to carry you through. This is her response. This is what she says. And I can almost see her picturing God with his arm outstretched. And we're going to sing a song now. These guys are going to do an item with these lyrics that it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. And while these lyrics may not be a reflection of your heart or your soul just yet, I pray that in this time, as we listen to it, and you can just sit and reflect on the lyrics, may this be a time where you can say to God, God, I've been stuck in this place of why. I've been tempted to pick up some bags of bitterness, and I may still not know why. In fact, I may still be a little angry at you, God. But I need your help. I need your help. I know that you're standing with your arms outstretched, and I need you to speak into my situation. So God, as these guys do this song, as we listen to this item, God, use it, God, to speak to us. May we find you in the midst of our trials. And even though this might not be a reflection of our soul just yet, may we move past this point of asking why and asking instead, what is the gift, God? What is the gift that you want to give to me in this season?